Let's take a look at some questions from section 8.1 in the practice of statistics. We're specifically going to take a look at number 11, 13, 19, and 23. Number 11 gives you some confidence intervals, and it asks which confidence level this could possibly be. So we need to think about what confidence intervals mean. So if you have a 95% confidence interval, what that is saying is if we took many random samples of the same size and calculated a confidence interval for each one of those random samples, 95% of those confidence intervals should contain the true value. So in this case, the true value they're wanting is this line, that mean right there. If we were to count all of these lines, you can see there's 4 of them that don't contain the true mean. So if you kind of make a fraction of how many of them do contain the true mean, just out of this picture, you get 84% of them. And so since 84% of them contain it, I would guess that the confidence level is probably 80% or maybe 90%. We can't say for sure, but it's going to be most likely one of those, since 84% of these confidence intervals contain the true mean. Number 13 is based on number 9. So I have the context for number 9 here. A New York Times CBS News poll asks a random sample of U.S. adults the question, do you favor an amendment to the Constitution that would permit organized prayer in public schools? Based on this poll, 95% confidence interval for the population proportion who favors such an amendment is 0.63 to 0.69. The news article goes on to say the theoretical errors do not take into account additional error resulting from various practical difficulties in taking any survey of public opinion. List some practical difficulties that are not included in the 3% point margin of error. Okay, so the deal with this is basically that confidence interval is only as wide as it is because it's taking into consideration the variability that can happen from sample to sample. Just from random sampling, you're going to get different answers. It does not take into account any other issues that could cause bias. So non-response or wording bias, those things are actually going to make the confidence interval wider, but we can't really account for that in our calculations. So maybe a practical difficulty could be when people answer this question, they feel like they're supposed to say yes, but they don't actually mean it, or vice versa. So it probably depends on where they're asking this question, but maybe they feel like they should say yes, so they do. And so it's perhaps that this confidence interval is like a lot higher than it actually should be based on what they got from their results. So that could be a practical issue. There could be other kinds of issues with a poll. They might have like non-response, like they tried to get in touch with people and they didn't respond. There could be under coverage, so maybe they only asked people via telephone, and they were like landline phones, and they're missing everybody who doesn't have a landline phone. So like that would be under coverage. So that's a practical difficulty that's not included in the margin of error. Question 19. Not very many people asked about this, but I actually noticed that a lot of people did not have the right answers, so I wanted to go over it. A 95% confidence interval for the mean body mass index, BMI, of young American women is 26.8, plus or minus 0.6. Discuss whether each of the following explanations is correct. Okay, so again, I talked about what a confidence interval means. It's not a probability, it's not a chance, it's not saying this percent lies within here to here. What it is saying is if we repeated this random sample of this particular size over and over and over and calculated a confidence interval for each one of them, each one of those samples, 95% of the samples will contain the true parameter. So really all the confidence interval is doing is giving us some plausible values for the parameter. So we cannot say that we're confident that 95% of the young women have a BMI between there and there, because these are just plausible values for the mean. Like that's what the confidence interval is giving us. Not for like individual women. So not the BMI for individual women, but like for the true mean. So I can't say that like all women fall between here and here, because that doesn't say anything about the mean. I also, for B, I can't really say this because I can't predict the future. I'm not predicting anything about the future. I'm predicting just plausible values for like the true parameter. That doesn't really have anything to do with future samples. Any value from 26.2 to 27.4 is believable as the true mean. There it is. That's the right one. You can see there's like plausible values. Any of those values are plausible. If we take many samples, the population will be between here and here in about 95% of the samples. Again, that's not what we're saying. It's not 95% of the samples. It's saying that 95% of the intervals that are created by the samples will have the true mean. So it's not that. And this is not true either. It doesn't say that it can't be 28, because we don't, we're 95% confident that the mean lies between 26.2 and 27.4, but that doesn't mean that it can't fall outside of that, because we're only 95% confident. So it doesn't completely rule out that possibility. So the only one that was correct was C. Question number 23 was a multiple choice that kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier with issues. The kinds of bias that's included in the margin of error, the only kind of bias that's included in the margin of error is what comes from doing random samples and like variability between random samples. So looking at these options, some people refuse to answer the questions. That's like non-response. That's not included in margin of error. People without telephones could not be in the sample. That's under coverage. So that's not included in margin of error. Some people never answered the phone in several calls. So that's also like a non-response. So actually none of those can be accounted for in the margin of error. The only thing that can be accounted for is the fact that from sample to sample, random sample to random sample, you would get different sample proportions and sample means. But you can't really, the margin of error in the confidence interval does not account for all of those other kinds of bias.